This is the final module of the Christian History mini course. And today we're going to look at modern Christianity, 1800 to the present, some of the new developments in the church, some of the things that have happened in the church. There have been some gigantic shifts in the Christian church over the last 200 years, even over the last 50 years, and I'll talk about those. All right, here you see a drawing of Billy Sunday, famous preacher of the early 1900s, sort of a forerunner of Billy Graham, who would also lead some huge religious crusades around the world. And revival preaching, religious crusades were kind of an innovation of this period, of the modern period. So we'll talk about them a little bit. All right, let's start with context. As always, I'll go through the context, then I'll talk about some big events that occurred. Then we'll look at doctrine and worship from this period, and finally end with focusing on one particular person. All right, so what's some of the context that we should understand in studying modern Christianity? Well, you've probably heard these terms, modernism and postmodernism. I wanted to talk briefly about what those are, how scholars talk about those, and how that affects what we're talking about today. Modernism is basically faith in the power of human beings to create, improve, and reshape their environment with the aid of practical experimentation, scientific knowledge, and technology. Okay, that's a technical definition by a scholar named Marshall Berman. Modernism is synonymous with the idea of progress. It rests on faith in reason, and it grows out of the age of enlightenment, the scientific revolution that we talked about in our last module. It's also characterized by self-consciousness and innovation. And what I mean by that is, especially if we look at the arts, visual arts and writing, literature, modern writers and artists are very aware of the traditions out of which they come, and they very consciously play with and alter those forms that are received from the past. So you see an example here of Picasso's A Cubist painting here in the top right. Picasso, like many others before him, he's taken a form, right, a portrait, but he's given it a twist. He's intentionally drawn all the different angles and shapes in kind of a fundamental way. All the shapes and angles that you would see in a typical portrait, and he's accentuated those. So modernism is characterized by this. It's a conscious alteration of forms that have been carried down from the past. It's the idea of playing with and trying new things with those forms instead of just following the status quo and making more and more of the same. Some scholars have noted that modernism, and along with it the Industrial Revolution that occurred in mainly the 1800s, and the colonization of third world countries, of third world places by European powers like Britain, and to some extent even the United States. Some scholars have said those things were really driven by white Western males, right? So the perspective that's given, even in a lot of traditional history books about these things, is written from the perspective of a white Western male perspective. So when we get to postmodernism, we find in that movement a critique of that white Western male modernist movement. Okay, so let's move on to that, postmodernism. Obviously, the name means that this is what comes after modernism. And inherent is a critique of modernism. So I need to state clearly that there's not a set boundary line, certainly not in time, between modernism and postmodernism. Some people say that we live in a postmodern age. That may be true in some sense, but we must remember that we live with a lot of the residue of modernism and a lot of the principles of postmodernism at the same time. We still have a lot of faith in science and technology and human reason. That's part of especially Western culture. But there are also postmodern currents. So what is postmodernism? Having said that, within postmodernism, there's greater skepticism about the possibility of finding truth in an absolute sense. You know, in the old days, we thought religion would lead us to truth. Modern scholars said, no, human reason will lead us to truth. Postmodern scholars say there is no absolute truth to go out and find. And they're more quick to say, truth is whatever we make it. So we're back to the Greek philosopher Protagoras. Man is the measure of all things. Truth, you know, you can have your truth and I can have my truth. And why is it so important that we discover some absolute truth? That's what a postmodernist would say. There is an embrace of what's called relativism and pluralism. The fact that there's lots of different worldviews, as you see the religious symbols here, lots of different worldviews in this world, and we should let everyone be and not insist on some universal set of laws and truth. And finally, as I just mentioned, within postmodernism, there's the idea of critiquing the white Western male perspective on everything. And this goes into theology as well. In the last 50 years, there have been people that have risen up and said, hey, why don't we look at Christian thinking and spiritual truths from a black perspective, per se, for instance, or a female perspective. So we have the rise of things like black theology and feminist theology, which again they're movements to reappraise spiritual truths in Scripture in light of perspectives other than what is considered the traditional, assumed, this perspective that was assumed to be correct, when really what these scholars, revisionists, are saying is it was really more of a male, white, Western perspective. All right, so again, we live with both of modernism and postmodernism today, and you'll hear voices, statements that will be reminiscent of either modernism or postmodernism, and sometimes even Western, sort of a traditional Western view that predates either of these. Okay, so they're all sort of mixed up in this world in which we live, and especially the Western world today. Moving away from the West, though, what about the non-West? Today I'm going to talk about the fact that Christianity in the last 50 years has experienced a gigantic shift, so that there are just as many or more Christians now in what's called the global South as there are in North America and Europe. So what about the non-West? I want to say a couple things that have been observed about non-Western worldviews. And by this, I'm mainly talking about Asia, South America, Latin America, and Africa, right? If we compare those cultures with Western culture, we can make some broad generalizations. So typically, here's a big one. Typically in the West, Westerners emphasize individual guilt and innocence, right? That's very important to us as Westerners. And again, these are all generalizations. There's always exceptions. But in general, the Western mind is preoccupied with guilt and innocence, with the rights of the individual, the accomplishments of the individual. And in contrast to that, many non-Western cultures emphasize different focuses. So, for instance, whereas we focus on the individual and his or her accomplishments, many non-Western cultures focus on community, so that rather than speaking of, what your own potential, what course in life you're going to pursue, the name you're going to make for yourself, many non-Westerners are concerned with how will my decisions reflect upon my family, my extended family, my ethnic group, or my nation. They're much more aware of that sphere. And if someone does something honorable, it honors the wider group. And if someone does something shameful, it reflects on the wider group to a much greater degree than typically it would in a Western nation. right? So community is one of non-Western emphasis. Another is the interplay between honor and shame. So what's very important in some nations, such Near Eastern, Middle Eastern nations, Asian cultures, is the preservation of dignity, your own dignity. And if you're in any kind of negotiation with others, it's important that everyone saves face, that you protect the dignity of others within a negotiation. Sometimes even at the expense of identifying who's right and who's wrong. You know, in the West, we're more concerned with, well, who's in the right? Who is obeying the law here? Who's being more honest? In some non-Western cultures, while those things would still have some importance, it would be even more important than proving who's right or wrong is protecting everyone's dignity, saving face, honor and shame. And if there's any sort of conflict between parties, it's not easy for non-Westerners to conceive that both could come away with the same amount of honor and dignity intact. If there's a conflict, often the understanding is one person's going to come away with more honor, the other is going to go away in shame. So thirdly, in some cultures, and this is especially true in many African cultures, although we see it in other areas. And once again, most cultures are a mixture of these. It would be very difficult or impossible to find a culture that was exclusively focused on one of these. Usually there's a mixture. But in many African cultures, especially, we find the culture is focused on these dynamics, power and fear. And quote unquote success in life is a result of recognizing and identifying who's got the power in your society, right? Who has the highest status, who has the power, and how can one live in accordance with that truth? How can one live in alignment with those power structures, right? Either to gain the favor of those people in power, to be submitted to them, or to somehow take power yourself. So this has been written about by scholars and people with experience in missions, Christian missions. They've noticed these differences, and the degree to which Christians can convey the gospel to other cultures, Western Christians conveying the gospel to other cultures, in large part depends on our awareness of these differences. So when we go to a culture where, for instance, honor and shame is more important than guilt and innocence, it's more important that we focus on aspects of the gospel story of Christ's life that also have to do with honor and shame, rather than focusing on the fact that Christ has atoned for our guilt and brought us innocence before the throne of God. While that's important, we need to really focus on the fact that Christ has removed our shame, that we had shame before God because of our sin, and now he's restored our honor by becoming an object of shame himself. So it's the same gospel, it's just put in slightly different terms. And what's amazing is, if you read the Bible with any of these focuses in mind, you'll see things that you might not have noticed before. There's something about Scripture that it actually, there are aspects of all of these dynamics in the gospel story and in Scripture. And because if you think about it, Scripture was lived out and revealed by people living in non-Western cultures. They were living in the Near East. And so if you go looking for honor and shame and those sort of dynamics in the stories of the Bible, you'll find it very readily. Also power and fear. So good things to be aware of, trends in the West and trends in the non-West.